Is there an area of your life that you would like to see different results in? And this doesn't mean in the form of money. It can, but what I'm talking about is results with your communication, your relationships, how you interact with your kids, your spouse, your friends, your employees, how the business is operated. Are those results good? Do you have great communication? Do you have great closeness, connection? Do you have all of these things? If not, it could be because there are unhealthy dynamics being formed. And usually, what I find is the same unhealthy dynamics that are in one area in your life are in other areas of your life. And sometimes they're there because they created something great. They worked for a while, but if the results aren't there, they're not working anymore. And sometimes the biggest shift in your life, the biggest change of results just requires a shift in the dynamic that has been formed. And that's what this episode is all about. So enjoy. Hi, I'm Brandon Lucero, and you're about to experience the new way to thrive in business, entrepreneurship, and life by leaning into who you are, what you love, and standing up for what you want to create. Get ready, because this is where we go against the grain, say no to outdated society norms, and we say yes to change in order to create a happier, more fulfilled world. Welcome to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. Trying to get this mic set up. Again, if you're watching live with us, or not live, if you're watching on the video and podcast on the website, you guys will notice outside again. I think this outside area is just going to be my new office from now on. Still haven't had things set up, but hopefully it sounds good. Hopefully it looks good. Because we have a pretty cool episode today. It's a little bit different. I think when we started the podcast, the intention was to tell a lot of stories and how people made it and what their journeys looked like, as well as mindset and personal development combined with messaging and business. It's just all the things I like talking about. And I think over the last 6 months, we kind of got away from, personal development and spirituality and mindset and those sort of things. And so what I'm hearing from a lot of people, that's what this episode is about, is jumping right back into that. And it's about shifting dynamics, which is something I remember talking about a couple of years ago on the podcast, but something that I've really have been learning more and more about from personal experience, which is always the best teacher. It's how we gain the true knowing. And what I've been hearing from a lot of people is that 2024 has been a year of disruption. It's been a year of just like things getting uprooted and things changing, and it just seems like a consistent theme with almost everyone I talk to. And it's been the same with me. It's been a really hard year personally, probably one of the hardest years I've ever had to go through from a personal perspective. And obviously the personal perspective shifts a lot, and everything else in your life, shifts business and how I show up in business and things like that. And so one of the things I've learned over this past year is the power of dynamics, and shifting dynamics is one of the, well, actually, and it could also just be the only way to really cause real, actual shifting and changing permanently inside of someone's life. And it's hard to do. It is really hard to do. It's uncomfortable to do. But when you shift the dynamic that you have inside of your life, it shifts relationships, romantic relationships, personal relationships, friendships, the relationships with your employees, how things get done in business, how things get done in your own life, the relationship with your kids, or how your household is run. There are dynamics that are running throughout everyone's life. And changing the dynamics allows you to change the results that you have in your life, whether that is a more connected relationship or, better results in business, changing the dynamic of how your marketing is done, better relationship with your kids, employees, whatever it may be. And shifting dynamics is a very hard thing to do. And so for what I mean by shifting dynamics is it's shifting essentially patterns. There are patterns that have developed on how you interact with people that are, frequently in your life, which again is going to obviously be your family and your spouse or your significant other, or it's going to be employees or whatever. There's patterns that get developed on what's acceptable and not acceptable, what a boundary is, what isn't a boundary, how to talk to each other, how not to talk to each other, what someone's going to accept and what someone's not going to accept, or even just how things are done, the time you get up in the morning, who gets up with the kids, like who's responsible for what in the business. There's these patterns that sort of get developed, and these are what I call dynamics. And so what I've realized over this last year is dynamics are formed usually naturally. People usually aren't intentional right off the bat with a dynamic that is being formed inside of a relationship. And the dynamic usually gets formed from whatever flows easiest, whatever works the easiest. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is also based on your own traumas and your own healing work and your own things within you. And what I mean by this is, like, if you're in a relationship with someone, romantic relationship, and you have a past trauma of I don't know, I'm just making something up, like getting cheated on, or something like that, or having trust issues in a past relationship, or even with your parents as a little kid, trust issues. Unless it gets healed, that's going to like come up inside of a romantic relationship in most cases. And that could cause a conflict, or it could be fine at first, right? Like maybe when your significant other goes out a lot, you're constantly checking in on them to make sure they're not doing anything weird or whatever. And maybe at the time they may think it's cute. Oh, well, they're checking up on me, they love me, and and that's just a very easy way to form a pattern inside of a relationship, right? And this could I'm just using romantic relationships, but it could be even with employees. Like maybe an employee forgot um, to do something, and it's been a repeated issue, and you let it slide. And one of the reasons why you let it slide is because you don't like uncomfortable conversations, because maybe you had a childhood where expressing your opinion wasn't safe, right? So you just let this pattern sort of develop, and it's based off of what is easiest. It's easier to not have that conversation, right? It's easier to just check in with your spouse versus not check in with them and fully trust them, right? And risk getting hurt. And so the dynamics form because it's what is easiest, but what's easiest sometimes isn't what's best. And when something becomes what's not best for you, it's going to build and build and build until there's a point where that just is no longer serving you anymore, and you're going to have to shift that dynamic. And the way I like to look at it is it's kind of like a river flowing down a hill, right? The water is just going to flow down the hill with whatever the easiest path is. And over time, that path is going to get deeper and deeper and deeper and more rooted and more rooted and more rooted. Like I look at the Grand Canyon, right? Like the Colorado River, it ain't going anywhere. You're not changing the Colorado River, right? It's like that's the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's not shifting and changing anytime soon. Maybe one day, I don't know. But anyways, the point is that river is going to find the easiest path. It's going to dig down deep. It's going to carve away. It's going to get more stronger, right? But there may become a point where now that river is causing damage. It's like tearing down another hill, or it's eating away at a bridge, or whatever it may be. And now that path has become destructive or damaging, and what's going to have to happen is that river is going to have to change. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take man hours to shift that river down a new path and away from the bridge it's destroying, or away from the mountain it's eating away at, right? It's going to take time and it's going to take effort. But when it's done, and it's maybe going to be uncomfortable, but when it's done, it leads to a better path. When the dynamic shifts, when the dynamic changes, even how hard it can be and how much work it's going to take, it leads to a better place. So with your spouse, and those issues are fixed, they don't feel like you're checking up on them, and there's more trust. It feels like you trust them more, and that starts to get developed. With your employees, if they're missing deadlines, and you decide to have those hard conversations and hold the boundary of what needs to happen inside the company and the business, the dynamic is shifted. That behavior, that pattern that you guys have developed no longer exists. And so dynamic is just a pattern that gets developed, but in order to create real change that's less damaging, you literally have to shift a dynamic. And it's really the way I want to break it down on this episode is really how people interact or communicate with each other. And this isn't just like your relationship. There's a lot of ways that dynamics get formed, and these are some of the things that I've had to learn this year is like it's the dynamic with yourself. How do you treat yourself? What's the talk, the dynamic of the language that you use with yourself? Do you continually let people walk over you? Do you have a hard time saying no? These are all dynamics of how you live your life. And there may be dynamics that were easier to live with, that got formed, that may need to be moved now. Dynamics that allow you to be able to say no, to protect your energy, to live your passion, to follow what lights you up, to start that business, to quit that job, ask that person out, have more me time, all of those things. And I think, with me, one of the biggest dynamics that has been shifting this year is actually my dynamic with myself. And that dynamic shifts a lot in my relationship with employees, business, but mostly my kids. And what I've realized this year is a big part of self-love was taking a look at the dynamics that I've built or the patterns that I've built inside of my life that caused me to feel overwhelmed, take on way too much, hard time saying no, being the caretaker, taking care of everyone around me. And it actually really did some damage because I'm not letting people around me grow because I'm trying to make their life easier. And that was like a big aha moment. It's like, okay, I have to shift this dynamic where I'm getting run into the ground, feeling unappreciated in multiple areas of my life from multiple people because I'm doing all of this stuff, being the martyr. And I was like, this is it's becoming an unhealthy dynamic and an unsustainable dynamic. And it's not allowing like my kids to grow, people around me to grow, team to grow. And it's not allowing all of that because I would just jump in and solve problems to make people's lives easier. And a lot of that was actually formed because my self-worth came from people pleasing and how much I can show up for people and be the nice guy and all of that stuff. And so that dynamic had to start shifting and changing. And it was a little rocky at first because like when you do so many things for so many people and then all of a sudden they become dependent on it, it causes a little bit of rockiness. It's that uncomfortableness, but it actually leads to a better spot where now the people around me can grow. They can learn from doing things themselves, and I get my time and space back. And it's finding that balance again, right? So the dynamic, but that all started with the dynamic, understanding the dynamics of myself. Like, how am I operating and showing up? Because I guarantee you, the same way you operate and show up with your kids and families, probably the same way you show up with other people, like maybe not to a T, but there's going to be overall arching reoccurring themes. And so there is a dynamic you form with yourself. There's dynamics you form with your romantic relationships that, like doing everything for everyone or your spouse all the time and letting them become dependent on that, not letting them grow. Like, all there's so many different dynamics and patterns. Another one could just be even how you guys communicate and how you regulate and all these things. Like every person regulates differently, and not understanding that could form these unhealthy dynamics where people explode and scream and the other person doesn't, and this and that, and the other person bends and walks on eggshells or bends over to make peace inside the house. And it's like these dynamics can get formed, which may not be the most healthiest thing in the world, but understanding that is a dynamic and a pattern that needs to stop, and you have to live in that uncomfortableness is where the change actually starts to create. It starts to exist, right? And so when we start to change the dynamics, change the patterns, and live in that uncomfortableness, you actually start to heal. You start to change the results you see in your life. And this, again, it goes even beyond just your relationships and self. It's the culture that you create inside of the company. Like, what is the communication dynamic between people and between employees, between you and employees? Listening with your kids. Like, what's the listening dynamic pattern that you have with your kids? How do you communicate with them? I think was doing homework, or not, sorry, not homework, I was driving down the road, and one of my kids asked me, Dad, how do you spell X, Y, and Z? I don't remember what it was. I'll just make up a word like house. Like, Dad, how do you spell house? Because they were going to do something like some artwork, and they wanted to write the word house. And they're like, yeah, how do you spell the word house? And I just very simply was like HOUSE. I gave him the answer and moved on. And then I sat there for a second and realized, like, whoa, that is a dynamic, a pattern that I didn't even recognize that I had. Because I just gave them the answer. And again, it goes back to that dynamic that I was talking about earlier, which was I just make things easier for people, and I don't give them the chance to learn. And that was like a big aha awareness wake up moment of like, whoa, I never saw that before. That's crazy. That's interesting. And so I just decided, you know what, next time that happens, I'm not going to give them the answer. How can I communicate differently? How can I change this dynamic? And I came up with the question of, well, how do you think you spell it? And so they asked me again a couple of days later, like, Dad, how do you spell X, Y, and Z? And I said, how do you think you spell it? And as they started to spell it, boom, 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 got one letter wrong. I said, that one's off. What do you think we changed it to? And then I realized just by changing the way in which I'm communicating, I'm shifting the dynamic. No longer will Dad just give you the answer. Dad's going to make you try to figure it out on your own. And it was beautiful because there was no argument. There was no fighting. Dad just gave me blah, 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 blah. And, you know, sometimes we live in this fear that if I change the dynamic, people are going to get mad and upset and this and that. And they might. But so what? But they also may not. And we don't know. And so there's just a beautiful way of like shifting on how I listen to my kids, how I show up for my kids, how I actually help my kids. It was like the dynamic, even the perception of what help looked like was totally shifted and changed. And now it led to a much better, healthier sort of relationship in that aspect of my life. This is also the same thing with your students and your clients. You know, like one of the other dynamics that I had built up with students back in 2018, which has caused me to actually not like the business and give it up altogether, was that I would just answer things right away in the Facebook group. And it just felt like it was just this never ending task of the Facebook group and people always needing it and answering at night and this and that. And it just drove me freaking nuts. And I just said, like, forget it. I'm just done with this. And I gave up the business and shifted to what we're doing now. I also didn't like what I was teaching. However, that was a communication dynamic and pattern that I had to take responsibility for, that I created with the students, and ended up driving me nuts, driving me freaking crazy, man. And so that had to shift and change too. And so then there's also dynamics in your marketing and patterns in your marketing. Like, you know, when you go into launches, do you guys get in the habit and dynamic of reusing things over and over again until they just don't work, or always creating something new? Or what is the process? What is the way of doing stuff? Because you as the leader, you set that tone, that pattern, that dynamic, the way things are, what's okay and what's not okay. And the team will follow that. The team will follow what is okay, what is not okay. And, you know, with us, we do have a dynamic and a pattern of reusing things from launch to launch to launch. And it's starting to wear out. Like, things just don't work. And then we scramble, and we've actually been on that dynamic and that pattern for years now. And even though I'm aware of it, we still haven't changed it. And so we're now in the process of changing it, where we're not going to continue to just reuse stuff all the time. There has to be freshness and newness. We got to stay on top of the ball. And it's so easy to sometimes fall back into that pattern dynamic. And so, you know, this year has just been a lesson after lesson after lesson of more patterns and dynamics that have been formed that aren't healthy anymore. And so one of the ways that I did this, I just asked, where is the biggest problem in my life? What is that? What doesn't serve me? Where is my biggest issue? And that usually leads to something there's an unhealthy dynamic there. And the first question I ask is, what role did I play in allowing that pattern and dynamic to form? Because I can tell you guys this right now, it's not the other person. It's you. You allowed that dynamic, that pattern, that way of being to form. And it's not your fault. You're not bad. It's not a good thing or bad thing. But, you know, it does take two to tango. So both of you have a responsibility of letting that form, because they too have a complete responsibility of letting that dynamic form. You both do. But there's no point. You can't change anything. And honestly, it only takes one person to start a shift and change it, right? So there's no point in blaming them for anything. It's you just shift yourself, and then they're going to have to shift in some way, or they don't, and they just won't be around. But what I find is most people do shift. Most people change. And so start asking, what do I not like? What is bothering me? What is overwhelming me? What dynamic, what pattern is happening? Do I have a dynamic of not being able to say no, of people pleasing, of this or that, or whatever it may be? And then you start to be aware of it. And awareness is key because you can't change anything unless you're aware. And then you start to shift and change it. But I also think it's really important to look at what is serving me. I think it's also equally important to look at what are the healthy dynamics I have in my life, because everything is a dynamic, everything's a pattern, everything's a way of being. It's a behavior. And you have healthy ones. And being aware of like, okay, this is a good area of my life. What dynamic do I have here that's serving me, working well with me? And when you know that, you can tap into it. You get to reuse it. You get to implement it in other areas of your life. If you have a very healthy dynamic with your spouse, maybe that dynamic will be great with employees or vice versa, or friends or whatever, right? Like, and I'm talking about communication sort of dynamics, right? Ways of operating together. And so when you become more aware of what's not serving you and the dynamics that aren't serving you, and then the dynamics of the areas that are serving you, you start to shift a lot of different things in your life to start living a life that you love, start living a life that is peaceful, start living a life that you enjoy more, that has less friction. And by the way, you may shift and you're gonna be fine for a while and more dynamics are gonna form. And this is a lifelong journey. You're never gonna get to a point where everything is working totally fine and great every single moment of every single day. But this process allows for a lot of shift and change and healthiness to start to be formed, a lot of wholeness, healing start to be formed, and healing when you become aware of those unhealthy dynamics. And then you look at like, why did I have this? Where did this come from? You can find out these different areas of your life that do need healing for wholeness. And that's the beauty in all of this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. I just wanted to share some lessons that I've learned from this year in unhealthy dynamics. It's just a download I got last night, outlined it, and wanted to film it today. So hope you guys enjoy it. If you're enjoying these episodes, let me know. Leave us a review on iTunes, and I will talk to all you guys later. Take care, everyone.
Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, go below, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you click on that bell icon and get notified every time we drop a new episode. Now, if you're looking for the show notes, we have them linked underneath this video, as well as our social media handles and some links to free training and offers that we drop from time to time to help you guys even further. So go check those out if you're interested, and thank you so much for tuning in to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast.